Hello, thank you for watching. And today I want to discuss a current trending video that I watched. I think I watched yesterday. Bill Maher program. He invited Sam Harris on for a one-to-one talk. And I think the video was uploaded to Bill Maher's channel. It's currently trending, and I watched the entire video. And I wanted to have some comments on it because I felt strongly about a few things that were stated within the video. And I just wanted to give my opinion on some of the issues that were brought up. Now, first off, I want to say that I kind of agree with some of the sentiments within the video. I agree with Sam and Bill that there needs to be dialogue between, I guess, the West and the Muslim world. I agree with that. I agree that the so-called Muslim ban was wrong and would be ineffective. So I agree with those things, but I think their approach, when they say that they want to have dialogue with the Muslim world, I think their approach is doomed to failure because they can only view the Muslim world through the actions of the worst elements that come out of that world. And I'm talking about here Islamic terrorists like ISIS or Al Qaeda. Anytime you look at a population and you can only view that population through its worst elements, any attempt to dialogue from that point on is, I think, in most cases, will be doomed to failure. I think the only time you can have dialogue is that you talk to people from that community who also accepts those same views, who also views their own community through its worst elements. And I think some of the people that they probably are used as examples, I didn't know all the people that they stated as examples. I know some of them are people who also agree with their assessment of the Muslim world. You know, the thing is, I think they recognize that the groups like they mentioned, like Boko Haram and ISIS, are minorities within within the Muslim world as a total. But they also back it up by the using of polling when Muslims in various countries are polled and their responses to these polls. Now let's talk about first the numbers of the people as a part of these organizations that are actually engaging in terrorism. They were kind of dismissive of the when people use equivalency arguments like, okay, well, in the West you have groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And Sam was very dismissive of that. He said, oh, the Ku Klux Klan is not as a marginal group. There are only a few thousand of them. But when you look at the numbers of some of these organizations, like Boko Haram, there's only a few thousand. I think there's wild estimates of all the numbers of the actual fighters in these organizations, but I think Boko Haram is under 10,000. You see numbers as low as 4,000 out there. When you compare that to groups in the West that are far right, it's basically the same thing. ISIS, the number of fighters, again, wild estimates of it, but you see a lot of numbers around 20,000 total in Iraq and in Syria. These are not really big groups, and I think their actions, their military actions, are more reflective of the situation in their countries, where you have very weak countries when it comes to security and military situation, who are either through poverty, like in Nigeria, or through war, falling apart due to the whole security situation is a mess. And you have these dangerous groups that fill in this vacuum that is just a product of where they're from, and doesn't really state anything about the sentiments of the entire population, either locally or internationally, when you're talking about the entire Muslim world. These far right groups that Sam was very quick to be dismissive of, if you look at their numbers and the countries that they represent, there are probably more members of far right organizations in the United States than there are fighters in Boko Haram or fighters in ISIS. So I'm very suspicious of these numbers arguments because that could cut both ways. And I think really when you're talking about the effect of these groups, their effect can be far greater than their actual numbers. Um, I mean, many countries in the world, a few thousand people armed can destabilize the entire country because of the weaknesses of their security situation, poorly paid police, weakness of their military. These situations don't really exist in the West, so you don't really have these problems with insurgency, although they do happen. You know, there are armed groups that have been active in the Western countries, but it's just an entirely different situation than what you see in other nations. So the effect of these groups can be a lot different than the effect of similar-minded groups in the West. Um, and I'm suspicious of these arguments where you also look at polling. Uh, you know, as atheists, and both of these guys are atheists, Sam and Bill, they should be aware that when you look at polling, especially when you look at polling of believers, of religious people, some of the things that they believe, at least when asked, when questioned directly, seem kind of shocking to someone who's not a believer. And it doesn't really reflect in the decency of these people as individuals. But when you ask them these questions in isolation, you get very, very dangerous answers, and that can cut both ways. And that's going to be in the Muslim world, it's going to be in the Christian world, it's going to be in the Jewish world. If you probably ask Israelis certain questions in isolation, you'll probably get very dangerous answers about a lot of different things. Um, I mean, I remember a recent question from Trump supporters where I think 20% of Trump supporters said that freeing the slaves was a bad idea. I mean, 20%. I mean, what do you get? 60 million votes? 12 million people think that, Americans? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But I'm very suspicious of these arguments, and I think we use this polling and these questions to back up your ideas. Where okay, you know that these are small minority people that actually participate in these acts, but you use the polling to amp up the numbers so that you can quickly continue to use those actions of those small number of people to paint a broad picture of the entire population. And I think that's only something that's a reflection of like tribalism. I think people recognize when you use the actions of the individuals to brand your group, when someone looks at you and say, okay, well, these groups represent you, you're quick to dismiss them, just like Sam was quick to dismiss the actions of like groups like the Ku Klux Klan, or I mean, there's all types of groups, skinheads, these alt-right groups. Um, he was quick to dismiss that because he can recognize within his own culture that those groups are marginal. But he won't accept that argument from a Muslim. And he'll use polling and other things to brand the entire group. But, you know, like I said, those polling can cut both ways. So I think it's just a factor of tribalism. And tribalism to me is when you see yourself as a member of a distinct group, but you look at other groups with suspicion, disdain, and sometimes in some cases hatred. He cannot recognize that Muslims, although a different group than he is, they have the same complexities and the same things that his own group possesses. And until he can recognize that and decide to dialogue with Muslims beyond just ISIS, Islamic terrorism, he'll always be at a disadvantage because people will be at a defensive. If you can only see them through the actions of these individual groups, no matter how dangerous they are, because their danger is well beyond their numbers. So we can't. I'm not disputing that at all. They're currently more dangerous than some of the far right groups in the West. But I explain why I think they are more dangerous because of the weaknesses of their societies right now. But instead of the dialogue should be helping the marginalized these groups even further. But instead, the dialogue is that you're responsible for these groups, and I think that's counterproductive. You know, they have shared cause here to both marginalize these groups. These groups are killing more Muslims than they're killing anyone else. And you see Muslim countries being in the forefront of fighting these groups. Even like a Muslim fundamentalist country like Saudi Arabia is regularly jailing Daesh, that they call them, members, and other Muslim countries are bombing these groups, and there's Muslim coalitions against these groups. So they have to look at the actions of these groups beyond just being representative of the Islamic world. They're just criminals operating within that world. And he has to recognize that. And if you want to have a real dialogue, you have to, and I don't know what the purpose of this dialogue actually is. I mean, because I think anyone who is not a direct supporter of these groups are critical of them. So what is the real purpose of this dialogue? I mean, what are you really, what common ground are you trying to really find here? And the fact that he's an atheist, I don't think he really has common ground with these groups. He doesn't really respect the authority of Islam, which he shouldn't. I mean, if he did, if you're not a Muslim, but I think the whole approach here is flawed, and he have to really recognize what is the end game here. What is the actual end game? So I have a lot of questions here, and I don't really have the answers to everything. But those are just some of the thoughts that came up while I was watching this tape, and I just wanted to share that.